they are making a product for those smaller companies, but only for those smaller companies to target their own market, which the general public cannot access either. So for that kind of purpose, because they are only targeting the domestic market, right? So for that part, I don't think there will be huge impact. But on the other hand, which means for the general consumer targeted companies, there might be problems. As I mentioned, the Chinese CAC has introduced the draft meters to regulate generative AI, right? And then I'm not sure how many of the audience they have read through the draft measures, but based on my conversation with government advisors and AI companies, the biggest concern for them is actually about one particular provision in the draft measures, which is about that generative AI providers should be responsible for the training data sets. That is to say, companies might be punished if the regulators are not happy with the answers of their chatbots. And as a company, I would feel this is unacceptable, because how can you do this? Because you need massive data sets, to train the model. For example, tech company would use Wikipedia, right? So that is a natural resource for training data. But how can companies ensure that all the text in Wikipedia is legal? I mean, here, legal is a quotation mark. I mean, in the context of the Chinese culture, because there's so many, sensitive words and topics in the country. So, for that aspect, there's still no definite answer to that. And I think the Chinese companies are still trying to figure this out. And I was at a seminar a few weeks ago with all these Chinese tech companies. And then one Chinese, one representative from one company proposed, not joking, about how to solve this problem. He said, maybe we need to invent another AI tool to censor those data sets and to see which is, which data set, which keyword or data set is in violation with the drafting measure. Of course, that is half joking. But what other companies are doing now is, as I heard, that they are only providing the foundation model services to businesses. In that case, even if some of the answers are not in line with the social value, the spreading of the results will be limited, which means it will not be overwhelming on social media and cause a big problem. And that is why none of the big tech companies is opening their chatbots to the general public, and only by invitation to try to use it.
Thank you, Susie. Lots of questions on AI and lots of other issues, which is fantastic. And thank you. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the next 20 minutes or so. There's one which, perhaps Susie, you could give a brief answer to first, and then there will be others on the call who will have interesting perspectives on it as well, I think, which is how you see the polarization of China, the idea of China versus the West economically and politically, and the idea of decoupling between the two, and how will this impact the R&D landscape? In other words, is decoupling happening? Is it desirable? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I think the decoupling has been happening in the past few years, particularly in the tech area. And of course, there will be an impact on talents first. Years ago, US-based Chinese scientists, particularly if they are China-born, they would figure that they studied in the US and they went to the US institutions or US, particular universities, right? They would visit China and communicate with Chinese scientists frequently, particularly in the AI sector. But now, the US scientists, particularly those with Chinese blood, who are working on top-notch tech sector, they are very cautious. And actually, China is doing the same. You can see that China has introduced this anti-spy law, which has led a lot of people, including those academics. And I think that definitely impact China's and as well as the US R&D as well. And for instance, because definitely you need to collaborate and communicate. And for the impact on the AI area, we know that generative AI is all about algorithm, computing power, and data sets. For the short term, I think geopolitics may have limited impact on R&D in terms of computing power, because computing power is about chips, right? So big, as we reported before, big Chinese companies, they have stockpiled enough chips to develop their foundation models in the next maybe 2 or 3 years. But the impact will get bigger as time goes by. And also in terms of algorithm, a lot of Chinese companies developed algorithms on previously public papers, such as the one published by Google in 2017, I think. And that one has been widely used by Chinese companies as a base to develop their algorithm. But as decoupling widens, just imagine if US companies choose not to publicize their findings, and then I think that there will be big problems for China.
Perspective, and I mean, one of the interesting things about the decoupling story is how varied it is, I think. And Alice, I'd like to turn to you, because one of the major themes of the semiconductor story that you started off talking about was about this triangle of interdependence that has developed in chips between China, US, and Taiwan, and that this, in other words, any kind of decoupling hurts everybody. So if that's your policy, then you should be prepared to take some damage yourself. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, exactly, and interesting actually. I was speaking to our colleague Annie in Taipei about this last week, and she actually recently travelled to Netherlands to speak to the executive vice president of ASML, which is the most sort of cutting edge chip producer in the world.
Chip equipment, particularly.
Equipment producer. And his headline quote was that he just thinks that decoupling is impossible. Like, as much as you want to do it from a geopolitical perspective, and as much as hot as the US-China tech war gets, practically it's just not realistic. And as you say, Michael, this is something that we've covered for over a year now on the Big Story desk. I think particularly when we talk about chips, we actually did a story last year about showing how the resilience myth, so this idea that, for example, American companies could start to onshore their chip production is a nice idea in theory, but when you actually look into it, when you actually look into things like labor costs, manufacturing costs, time, just the sheer amount of time and training that it takes to onshore these sort of production processes, it's just not realistic for a company that's looking to keep growing. And yet the level of dependence of these huge tech companies, whether we're talking about Apple, whether we're talking about Foxconn, that they depend so heavily on not only mainland China but Taiwan, which of course is another big flashpoint, that all of this talk of decoupling is now, as I mentioned earlier, moving more towards a slightly more, not neutral, but a slightly less extreme version of de-risking, which is also what the G7 started talking about this year, is that perhaps decoupling is not possible, but perhaps there are other ways to de-risk without completely detaching yourself from doing business in China and Taiwan, and we'll see how that plays out for the rest of the year. I think de-risking will start to become an even hotter word than decoupling, perhaps going forward.
And maybe somebody will
Actually.
I mean, one sort of interesting theme, I think, of a lot of the conversations including today about economic development is this price of growth. And this is something I'd like to turn to you on with regards to the Indonesia arena, because several of the questions in relation to mining in Indonesia have picked up on the environmental point. For example, Pompeo asks, what are the environmental implications of the construction and production of nickel? Rio Oeki says, Indonesia still relies heavily on coal for energy production, although the government has taken multiple countermeasures to fight climate change. How do current global greening initiatives impacting Indonesia, both positively and negatively. Ajay Budecha says, are there nickel developments in Indonesia involving private sector development and capital, or is it mainly SOE government developed and funded? So, yeah, quite a lot of really important questions there. From an environmental point of view, how is the government handling that? Both the coal dependence and the fact that obviously any metal mining industry is inevitably polluting.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and thank you for the questions. Yes, that's true. Environmental issues is a very huge theme also in industry. We actually had a big story last year about that, discussing lengthily about these environmental impacts, focusing on the Morowali project, which is currently the biggest nickel processing project in Indonesia. There are dozens of companies there, mostly from China, but partnering with Indonesian companies. So anyway, yeah, that's true. So the environmental issue, because Indonesia for power, for electricity generation, still relies heavily on coal, and like these smelters are power hungry. They need a lot of power, and so far all these nickel industrial parks are still mainly powered by coal. But actually, due to these rising environmental scrutiny over the past year, the good thing is there are growing awareness among them, and there are growing plans. They are planning to build renewable power plants. For example, the Morowali Industrial Park, they're planning to build a huge solar power plant, and also another part of Sulawesi Island, they're going to do that too. And also the Harita Nickel on Obi Island also planning I think 200 megawatts solar power plants. So there are, amid these common pressures, there are efforts now to replace the coal power with renewable power plants. But unfortunately, we haven't really seen the result yet. I mean, probably it will come on stream in the next few years. But I mean, there's at least I see seriousness, because, like for example, one of these Indonesian nickel companies that had an IPO this year, they are under a lot of common pressure, and they're currently in talks with their off-takers in Europe, the European EV makers, exactly how to solve these environmental issues. Because electric cars, electric vehicles all over the world, and the electric car makers, they probably they refrain from getting directly involved in nickel production or cobalt production, which are controversial. But they still use those nickel, and like the problem is like the so-called class 1 nickel, the higher grade nickel used for batteries, which are probably not as polluted as Indonesia's low grade nickel. The class 1 nickel from Canada, New Caledonia, and also Russia, the reserves are getting depleted, so the world has to rely on Indonesia's nickel, unfortunately. So yeah, there are awareness of that, and there are efforts to address those issues. So let's see in the next few years. Let's scrutinize the industry again to make sure that they're walking the talk. And also to answer some of the questions. I think one of the questions touched on the amount of investment needed.
Yes.
So it's very capital intensive. For example, a nickel smelter project to produce a battery material called MHP, which is a mixture of nickel and cobalt. It at least needs $1 billion. So that's why Indonesian companies can't do this alone, and Chinese companies are very interested, and that's why there's a lot of China investment in that. And to answer another question, most of these investments are made actually by the private sector, private companies in Indonesia, and most of them from China. And just like there's a few state-owned Indonesian companies are involved in this project. And also like the IPOs, Indonesia's biggest IPOs this year, the two largest are by privately owned nickel companies, the Harita Nickel and Rebecca Battery Materials, both of them are partnering with China. And back to the environmental aspect, I think with Ford Motor coming in and some European car makers also coming in, there are some expectations from industry players or analysts to improve the environmental practices in this nickel smelters industry. So I think I've answered all the questions, hopefully.
Yes, and thank you for questions. Thank you, Oida. And of course, as you indicated, I mean, there are two angles to that environmental story. There's the effect on the planet, but also the fact that companies and investors also put their own pressure for ESG performance benchmarks. And this is something that will obviously play very big in the debate over environmental protections as the industry expands. Now, we only have a few minutes left. I'm just going to come to a couple more questions. But I just wanted to flag a question I'd like to close with, which is an interesting one, just to give you all a few minutes to think about it, which is from Lyric Hale. And the question is, what is the Asia story that you think is not getting enough attention? So I'll come back to you all in a few minutes on that one, once you've had a chance to think about it. And in the meantime, Subhasa-san, I'd like to come back to you because there's an interesting question about super apps here from the audience. And the question is, do you see Grab going down the same path as Uber? Their monopolization attracts regulations, and as a result, the industry is worse off. Or what's different in the Asian market compared to the US and Europe?
So in terms of the regulation on the monopoly, there was a big argument when Grab acquired Uber's Southeast Asia. A few governments, apart from Singapore as well, I think Philippines, they kind of scrutinized as a deal quite heavily. It got cleared out. That was already 5 years ago. But I think the most important regulation now is the protection of the gig workers, which Singapore has become the first country to, in Southeast Asia at least, to sort of ask these performers to better protect the gig workers with the pension system on par with full-time employees here. These people have very stable jobs. They make a lot less than full-time employees, and they don't have full insurance as well. So Singapore is still sort of sorting out the details at the moment, but there was a big fear from the platformers that they might have to end up treating all these gig workers as employees. But in the meantime, at the moment at least, the government said they won't be asking them to treat them as full-time employees. They see the benefit of these technical services for the workers themselves as well. But we will see. I think there'll be more governments in the region sort of looking at Singapore as Singapore's regulation as an example, and might come up with their own rules. Certainly in the US and California, Uber was asked to, all these platformers was asked to treat the gig workers as employees. So maybe not on a similar scale, but there are definitely some movements in this area too, which might become a challenge for the business in the long term.
Thanks, Subhasa-san. And yes, we're in the last 3 minutes.